When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello guys, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, I want to talk about Season 5 of Game of Thrones. Was it as bad as we remember it, and all of that? So I've been kind of going through Game of Thrones once again, and my big focus was I wanted to do a video on Season 5. I feel like it's the most overlooked season in the entire show. It's not as drastically bad as Season 7 and 8, but it also doesn't have those big bangs that end out the season like Season 6, and that's why so many people kind of look back on Season 6 and like it. Season 5 is kind of like that forgotten child. It just doesn't really get brought up in a lot of discussions outside of if people are talking about, oh, the prime of Game of Thrones, or when did Game of Thrones fall off? And many people point to Season 5, and I definitely understand why people do, and I even kind of agree to it. But I want to talk about in depth what this season did right, what it did wrong, how does it fare even now looking back on it retrospectively, you know, with all the issues we see coming later on in the show. How good or bad was Season 5? And I want you guys to let me know down in the comments before I get into the nitty-gritty and all the things about this season. Tell me what you remember of Season 5. You know, since the last time you've watched it, what do you think of Season 5? But before we get further into the video, if you didn't want to become a Patreon or a member, you do get videos early, and I'm doing all my exclusive House of the Dragon stuff on there, so consider that. But let's get into it. So Season 5 is one of the most mixed pieces of content that I've ever seen, I think, in my life, because it's so jarring. You go from one scene, could be a terrible Dorne scene, to the next scene being a, you know, you're at the wall and Jon is trying to command and trying to, you know, get the wildling south of the wall, or all this stuff is breaking down. It's a really good scene. And the thing that took away the most from this reread, because again, they still had material that they could adapt during this season, and I felt like what D&D were trying to do, they were going to try and combine it into one season. That was never going to work. I don't know what possessed them to try and do that outside of they were just rushing and they just wanted to get on to the next project. This should have been at least 2 seasons. I've talked about this in my rewrite of the seasons. And so keeping that in mind with what their focus was, they wanted to condense it all into one season. And so you can definitely tell that because of certain plot lines. So on one hand, the good plot lines for the most part are Jon's plot line, Cersei's plot line, Daenerys' plot line, and for a good part of it, Tyrion's plot line is a focus. And I want to talk about Tyrion, but I actually think that besides the Young Griff stuff, they handled Tyrion's second half of the Dance with Dragons material a lot better than the book does. It's actually some of the weakest content of all of A Song of Ice and Fire. And so let's kind of talk about that, because those are kind of the main goods. I'll even throw Stannis in there. I think Stannis is good for about 90 to 95% of the time he's on screen, but they kind of have a House of the Dragon moment where you build up everything great, but you definitely do not stick the landing, and so I'll talk about that as well. But the place where this falls flat is kind of the other stuff, right? Sansa's plotline's not great in this season. The Dorne stuff is pretty darn bad. So it comes to a lot of those secondary plot lines that they really fall flat. Even, for instance, Bran, that whole plot line's just not in this season for some reason, just basically because they're rushing along, and so they took, I guess, a season off from Bran. And so what you kind of get is a mixed bag. Every episode varies in quality heavily depending on what plot lines are a heavy focus. So for instance, right, episode 5, it's a one where it kind of focuses a lot on Jon and Daenerys. It does a really good job of being that midpoint of the season and refocusing where we're going to go with plot lines. So, you know, going to Hardhome, or Daenerys, you know, having to make this decision to marry Hisdar and bridging that gap and trying to fix how do, you know, we get Meereen back together and stopping this kind of civil war that's going on. And so episode 5 to me is probably the second or third best episode of the season, and it doesn't have a lot of bad things. But the reason is not because of some of those plot lines that I talk about that are bad being good in this episode. It's because, for the most part, they're not in the episode. So then, for instance, you have episode 5, which I actually think is a pretty good episode, but then episode 6 and 7, because they kind of focus a lot more on some of the other plot lines, like Dorne, for instance, they're probably the 2 worst of the season. But then episode 8 is the Hardhome episode, where you focus almost purely on Jon. The episode's pretty good again. So it's that issue that plagues season 5 is that certain plot lines, the main ones from Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, are for the most part handled pretty well in season 5, outside of a couple things here and there. It's the minor plots, because they try to combine plots. For instance, they try to combine Sansa's Veil plot with also then the Jane Poole's plot line, which just blows up in your face. And it's so weird because at times Sansa's arc is actually good because it's taking, Jane Poole's arc with Theon, and Theon's good just in this season in general. And so you have good moments in it, but then you kind of sit back and you go, wait, this is Sansa, so it also isn't good either. So it's weird because you have this polarizing factor between every single episode. And so this season to me is the last real season of Game of Thrones, because it still has some of those good plot lines. It has some of those moments that make sense all the way out throughout the season. And this season for me is far more enjoyable to watch than, say, season 6, because season 6, all of its quality is backloaded into the last episode or a couple moments throughout the entire season. And so you have just a couple moments, or the last episode, or even the Battle of the Bastards is entertaining to watch, even though it's illogical. But season 6, for the most part, is filled with plot holes. Majority of the season is filler, and it doesn't actually do anything for the plot. Where season 5 is kind of the opposite. It just has all of the good moments filtered throughout the season, but you also have all the bad moments filtered throughout the season as well. So you're kind of going into episodes where you're half of it, you're liking it. You're like, yeah, I like this plotline. And the other half, you're like, what are we doing? So you come to the point where you don't have really any outstanding episodes outside of maybe Hardhome in this season, which is why I think it's not remembered that much compared to season 6, right? Season 6, everybody loves the last episode. They like Battle of the Bastards. Some people really like the Hodor reveal. And so those are memorable for people going forward. And so episode 10, for instance, the finale, you would think it'd be one of these, massively great episodes. And it just isn't. It's like half of the plot lines end on a pretty good, reasonable spot. And then other plot lines, it's like, it's kind of fluky how we even get there. So let's go plot line by plot line and kind of like figure out where this season is. So in Jon's plot line, for instance, the first kind of half follows the book, not exactly closely, but pretty closely, where it's him, becoming the Lord Commander, because again, they're actually quite far behind in terms of where Jon is at in the book compared to the show. Because if we're going off of where the book ends, the show should have had Jon become the Lord Commander already. So we open this season with having him become Lord Commander. How is he kind of dealing with Stannis? That's kind of like the first half arc for Jon, is more about kind of, having this early control of the Lord, being Lord Commander, and dealing with Stannis, killing Jaina Slynt, all that stuff, that's already in the book, Mance Rayder's death, which in the book is different, but all of that's kind of the same here. And so it feels kind of written right out of the book. It follows it somewhat closely, but it doesn't go fully into it, right? And I think Jon's plot line, outside of kind of a couple moments, is actually like on par with what we get in the book. Like, for instance, there is some stuff in Jon where it just feels like he has too many chapters, where, we're just getting too much with the character in terms of things that are not as enjoyable to read, for instance. And so I think the show does a good job of kind of cutting that at times, and I think it does a pretty good job of that plot line. And so we go from, the first half, the second half being, trying to get the wildlings south because the others are coming, and, you go to Hardhome. And I think people, forget. And the problem is season 5 does get hurt a lot by season 6 and going forwards, is this season is the first real season that we kind of see the White Walkers, that we see the Night King in its full power, right? The Night King, coming out to the dock at Hardhome is still one of the most iconic scenes of all time. For Game of Thrones, it's like this oh shit moment where you have this standoff where you're thinking, yeah, Jon and the Night King eventually are going to have some sort of standoff, but then they don't. So yeah, it's one of those things where you have to kind of look at season 5 as a whole and try to judge it just on what it was building. And so, it has beautiful moments like that, but because of the way the show ends, you kind of go, it's not as important now. How this season ends with Jon, for instance, right? It's this moment that's really powerful. I remember, because season 5 is really the first season that I really remember kind of watching episode by episode for the most part. And so getting to Jon's death And, you know, I'd read it in the books, and so I was kind of prepared. I knew it was going to happen, but it still was one of those gut-punching scenes because, you know, in the books right now, we don't know if Jon's going to come back. It seems like he's going to, but, you know, at this time, right, it was a big phenomenon. Is Jon Snow going to come back? And, you know, retrospectively, it's like, yeah, obviously he's going to come back, but still, it hit hard. It's a really big moment. And Jon's arc, you know, for the most part, can kind of be described as, you know, it does a really good job adapting the material, but it doesn't go beyond in terms of the big moment. Like, Jon Snow's death in the book is way better than the show. It's not even close, right? Because the issue with the show version, and it's not like, I still think it's very good, right? I don't think it's bad. I'm just saying, like, why it's not as good as the book is Jon is kind of getting killed by people that already hated him to begin with, right? Or maybe you have a couple people here and there that kind of have come to Alistair Thorne's camp where, you know, they just don't like Jon. Whereas in the book, it's like you have a bunch of people that they don't dislike Jon. It's, you know, they might have voted for him to become Lord Commander, and they turn on him because they genuinely think he's going to get them killed. You know, people having tears in their eyes as they're killing Jon. That's not really the vibe that they go for in the show, and I think, you know, that's okay. I think it's still very good in the show, but I just don't think it ever hit the book version. And so Jon's plotline is definitely kind of holds this season up for me personally. I think it was the most enjoyable for me. Whenever there was Jon scenes, I was pretty happy. But let's kind of transition to kind of some other plot lines that I want to talk about. For instance, Sam, within the Jon Snow plotline, I was pleasantly surprised going back with season 5. I'm a big hater of Sam's plotline in A Feast for Crows. I just think it's one of the weakest of probably all of A Song of Ice and Fire. I think it's probably, if you were going to rank POVs, and I have, he's probably bottom 5 for me in that book specifically. And so I actually really like what they did here. They kind of took elements of that plotline and they put it here, right, into Jon's plotline. So Maester Aemon's death, you know, Sam and Gilly hooking up and all of that. I actually think Sam is handled pretty well, and Sam is quite a different character in the show than he is in the book. Like, in the book, he's still kind of a timid character who's still afraid of a lot of things. Sam has kind of taken this long journey of finally growing as a character, and I really enjoy that because, you know, he's the one that suggests becoming a maester, right, going to Old Town and all of that. I really enjoy the growth of the character. I think it's a different take than the book, and I think it works for me. And, you know, season 6 has to take on, unfortunately, Sam's arc, which they don't really execute to the fullest, and a part of that's because it just doesn't land as well. But talking about just Sam in this season, I think he was really good. I think, again, everything at the wall I thought was really well done in this season. So let's kind of transition to the next one. So Stannis. Stannis is, I think, the weirdest plotline in this season because, in one sense, he's really good throughout almost all of it. They follow pretty closely to what happens in the book, or not that closely, I guess, because of Deepwood Mott not really being a thing in the show, but they, you know, follow closely in terms of Stannis wants the wildlings for his army, but then, you know, Jon kind of talks him out of it, and it's it's definitely different in the book and the show, but I think it still works pretty well in the show. Stannis and Jon's dynamic is really fun to watch. It's really enjoyable, just like how it is in the book as well. And so Stannis, you know, leaving, going to try take Winterfell, and as his march goes, he becomes more and more desperate. And you see this character, which, again, I don't know if people still criticize this. I remember seeing people criticize Shireen's burning and, you know, Stannis' character, and I think people have to kind of separate Stannis in the show versus Stannis in the book. Stannis in the show, even in the prime of Game of Thrones, was never what he was in the book. Right, in the book, there's more depth, there's more layers to Stannis than there ever was in the show. We get more of Stannis' background in the book. We get more of that, I guess, deeper side of Stannis, you know, talking about Renly's peach, or how, you know, he still is haunted by Renly's death and the peach that Renly had and all of that. That riddle that Stannis is trying to figure out with Renly's peach. All of that's never in the show, so you can't exactly blame Season 5 for that, because that's actually an issue of the earlier seasons. And so Stannis burning Shireen is a moment that feels earned. It was foreshadowed in earlier seasons. There's a specific scene with Shireen, with Mel, and also Selyse talking about this very thing, why she needs to be brought north. So it all feels like it was put in place. It was developed over, you know, seasons at this point. And it just takes Stannis, you know, who's in the show much more of a puppet of Mel's, more or less. Mel has much more sway over him than, she does in the book. And so when you have this position where, you're getting very desperate, your men are dying, you're all freezing, and the only way you see out is what Mel's offering, burning Shireen. And then, you have these conversations that Stannis and Shireen have, and it makes it more heartbreaking, where Shireen is almost basically signing her death wish. And Shireen's death will still be one of the most haunting things I've ever seen in a show. Like, hearing Shireen's screams, something it still hits every single time. And I think it's not remembered as, such an iconic moment of the show because of the way Stannis' arc finishes. And the biggest issue with Stannis' finish to the season, and it's the biggest issue with his arc, is D&D did not really know what to do with the character and how to kill him off. Because I agree, the character did need to die at some point, and we were kind of getting closer to it. So if you were going to do it, I think they had it all kind of in the right direction until the very last episode. Because the way Stannis should have gone out is you should have had it, instead of Stannis just walking up to Winterfell and dying like an idiot, you should have had it have been one of those things where Stannis is kind of reflecting on everything that happened. Mel abandons him. Stannis thinking about, how his brother died and, how he's killed his own daughter, which caused, his wife to kill herself. Have that actually affect him and be like, we're going to set a trap. I know we are going to lose. We don't have the men, but we're going to set up a trap, or some way we're going to lure them into the forest, and we are going to kill as many of them as we can possibly do. Because then it would still, have this idea that Stannis is a broken character because of all these things, which is why he's able to do like a suicidal march on Winterfell. But also you have him using his battle tactics that's been built up throughout the entire show, that he is one of the best military commanders in Westeros, or the best at this time. So it would have him, actually putting up a fight, but also you can still have him die. And the biggest issue is Stannis' death, because it just doesn't make any sense with Brienne somehow finding Stannis, especially when the way the show does it, where they're nowhere near the forest. How did Stannis get back to these trees, and he's isolated alone when he'd be the main target of everybody? He's in the very front line. How does he get back to these trees so that Brienne can kill him? Doesn't make any sense. And so if you want to set that up, because I don't think the ending is actually that bad for Stannis, when you actually take away the isolated scene just of Brienne killing Stannis, it makes a lot of sense, right? It's kind of poetic in a way, because Brienne wanting revenge and all these things pulls her away from her duty with Sansa, and we'll talk about that plotline in a little bit, and actually getting revenge has been something that, yes, George does play with quite a lot in the series, so that ending does actually make sense. It's also a fitting end that Stannis, kind of his sins come back and that's what kills him. That actually is a fitting end for the character. It just wasn't executed that well. So let's kind of talk about a little bit more of the North and kind of the plot lines that were going on in the North. Let's talk about Sansa and Theon, and I guess we'll talk about Brienne as well. This plot line just doesn't fit. I think Theon is fantastic throughout the entire episode. Him trying to rediscover himself and become Theon again is really good throughout the season. I think Theon is the most consistent of all the characters going on. Let's throw Littlefinger in here as well. But Sansa kind of has a complete character assassination in this season. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know what possessed D&D to have Sansa, who finally escapes, King's Landing and Joffrey. It seems like she's on the up. She's having this arc where she's going to become this player, what she ends up basically becoming, and then giving her to Ramsay, because it doesn't make sense for Littlefinger. You take your most valuable asset and give it away to the Boltons, who are likely going to be destroyed at some point. It just doesn't fit any of his motivations. Littlefinger is all over the place in this season in terms of when he's at King's Landing with Cersei, or when he's talking to Roose Bolton. Roose Bolton, or Sansa and Littlefinger in this season pretty much get character assassinated. Just their motivations don't make any sense. The story is just bad. One of the worst scenes of this season is Sansa being raped. Why we needed to see this, I don't know. I understand where they were coming from, because they are adapting a scene that's much worse than the book. but we still didn't need to see this. You can still allude to it, right? You can just have their marriage and then show Sansa, like, how they end up doing, where Theon comes in and she's not eating, she looks bruised, she's been beaten. The same effect happens, you just didn't need to show it, and that plotline shouldn't have happened anyway, but yeah. And there's good moments layered in it, right? I'm not saying the whole plotline's bad, but the way we get there is terrible. And because, they're adapting Jane Poole's arc, you have some of those moments with her and Theon that work really well. And it's interesting, that dynamic, having Sansa and Theon, because, Theon presumably killed her brothers, and Sansa being so close to Theon, it is an interesting dynamic. It just didn't work. It falls flat. There are scenes to like throughout the season in terms of those two, but overall, it just was not good throughout the entire season. Same goes with Littlefinger. Anytime Littlefinger's on screen, he's doing stuff that doesn't make any sense for the most part. He was not very good in this season at all. Brienne and Podrick are just a weird duo in this. Like, they're good together, and so there's isolated scenes where the two of them, building both of their characters, are fantastic. Right? There's a scene early on in the season where you have Brienne telling the story of Renly Baratheon, why she loved him so much, because, she was saved by him from all the mockery and all this stuff. And it's one of the reasons that she was so devoted to him. So when you get stuff like that, and you get her, trying to help teach Podrick to fight, and those two growing, a bond together, those scenes are great. But the issue is, all they do in this season is, somehow they find Sansa going all the way through the Vale with two of them, something that in the early seasons just wouldn't have happened. You've got them running into Sansa randomly, which is kind of weird. It just seems weird. They run into Arya and Sansa within the span of like 3 or 4 episodes. Like, that's crazy. It shrinks the world. Brienne just has nothing to do in this episode. Like, she just kind of sits around and doesn't do anything. Like, her plan to help Sansa is stupid. Sansa is supposed to light a candle. Are you telling me that Brienne is going to be looking at this tower for 24/7? Like, it's just not believable. And I think Brienne, it's unfortunate because the overarching plot line doesn't work. Like, the end point makes sense. You wanted her to kill Stannis, but then also be in a position to meet Sansa and help her going through. But it just falls flat throughout most of the season. And again, it falls in the same issue. And there's some good in it, but there's also a lot of bad. So I guess moving kind of down through Westeros, looking at Cersei, I think the King's Landing plot is by far the most sound plot outside of like the North. It's the same as like season 6, right? It's kind of like that really good plot line, and that's kind of where Cersei is, right? This is the fall of Cersei. All these mistakes she's making. They do a very good job of adapting Feast for Crows, in my opinion, taking the most important parts of that arc, and they do change it around, right? They do change it quite a bit with, like, Loras's capture, him not actually going to Dragonstone, and then Marjorie getting captured, and all this stuff. And I think it is a little flimsy in terms of like how Loras gets imprisoned because he has this birthmark, but at the same time, like this, you can also explain it ways the Sparrows didn't actually care. Like, this whole trial, like Cersei had, was just kind of a show, right? They were going to imprison him regardless. And so they get Marjorie and Loras, and so it still works. It's not like horrible logic. I can see where we were going. I can understand the logic there. And so that plot line is so interesting because it takes a character that we hate, right? The way she treats Tyrion, the way she treats, other people around her, the way, she helped get Ned killed and all these things. We hate Cersei. She is like the main villain after kind of Tywin dies, maybe outside of like Ramsay, for instance. But the writing for Feast for Crows of Cersei is so well done in Feast for Crows and Dance Dragons that you hate the High Sparrow more. Like, the things that she gets put through, this torture and her having this walk of atonement, still one of the, these scenes that's horrible as she's being, shamed basically throughout the entire castle, or the entire city, I should say. Cersei is fantastic from beginning to end. For me, I think her arc, the North arc, and I think Dany's arc in this season are my top 3 favorites. I don't have a lot to really complain of outside of like Littlefinger stuff that pops up in this season. For the most part, she is fantastic. Jaime, on the other hand, oh boy, is he bad. Starts good. It kind of starts good with like his reaction to like, Tyrion killing, his father and all that. But then as soon as he goes to Dorne, it just falls apart. Everything is just terrible in Dorne. They completely butcher the Sand Snake plot. There's genuinely nothing I can say that is good about the Dorne plot. Is the only plot I think of the entire season where the only positive thing I see from this is like Myrcella and Jaime's, talking scene, the last one before she dies on the boat in episode 10. Outside of that, there is nothing good about the entire Dorne plot. And it takes up a sizable amount of time. It's unfortunate. I don't understand why they did it. I mean, I kind of do because it buys you time. You don't have to do the actual Dorne plot. And then you don't have to do the Riverland plot for Jaime, which is a shame, given Jaime is probably the best POV of A Feast for Crows. And then the Dornish stuff is, like, especially Ariane's chapters are, like, top 10 chapters of the book. It's quite weird that they combined two plot lines that should never have been combined. And so, yeah, I have nothing positive to say about Dorne in this season. It's the thing that every time you see it on screen, you want to throw up. And just like Tyrion does in this season at the very beginning. So let's kind of transition to Tyrion. Tyrion is a very weird one. Because if you actually look at what the show does with the character, I actually think they do a pretty decent job with him in this season. It is unfortunate we don't get to see Illyrio, but his conversations with Varys are quite interesting in terms of, why keep living, right? Because Tyrion's gone through all this terrible stuff. How is it going to get any better? And him being convinced to go see Daenerys, but he still isn't fixed, right? It's just giving him some purpose to do outside of just, drinking himself to death. And the conversations him and Varys even have about kind of life and kind of what all occurred in King's Landing, and all of that's pretty good. The glaring issue that this season has is it's detrimental because of the Young Griff stuff not being there, which I think the show sorely needed. They sorely needed the Young Griff plotline, in my opinion. And so you don't get that because of what they do with Tyrion, where they kind of skip everything. They skip over all of Young Griff stuff, which I don't think is bad. I think minimizing Tyrion's plotline is a good thing, right? Tyrion takes up far too much of a Dance with Dragons. It's one of the biggest negatives of that book. He just got minimized in this season, which I really enjoyed. I just wish we would have gotten the Young Griff stuff instead of Dorne, for instance. But if you look at what we get, him getting captured by Jorah, and then Jorah and, Tyrion having this back and forth, which works much better than it does in the show, or much better than it does in the book. The book, they just have no actual interesting conversations. Jorah is this brute that's actually quite unlikable in the book. In the show, Jorah is a likable character. And so the two, have some interesting conversations, like talking about, how, Jorah's father died, mutinied by his men, and how talking about that idea. Jorah and Tyrion are quite interesting, talking about what Daenerys will do even when they get there. The one bad scene that I can distinctively remember for Tyrion is the whole cock scene with like dwarf cocks apparently being lucky and all that. Terrible scene from Tyrion. It's the one bad one. But then, they skip a good majority of the slave stuff, right? Another kind of low point of A Dance with Dragons. Just more or less just skip it, where it's like, oh, they get into a slaving fight, and maybe it's a convenience. It is a pretty big convenience that Daenerys shows up to the one fighting pit that Jorah and Tyrion are at, but I'm willing to excuse it to not get all that other stuff that we get with Tyrion and just expand that plot. It's not a very interesting plot to begin with, so I'm glad they kind of just glossed over it and just skipped right to the interesting stuff. Daenerys and Tyrion, all of their scenes are quite interesting, right? The way, Tyrion's like asking Daenerys, why should I serve you? Flipping it on her, and their conversations are quite interesting. Like Daenerys' speech about, I'm going to break the wheel, doesn't look great because of later seasons, but in this season, it actually works quite well. Two of the main characters finally meeting, and I think they actually did a pretty good job with it. And Tyrion, ending out where he's actually in charge of Meereen while Daenerys is gone, it feels like a natural ending point for his arc, and I really enjoy that we just didn't waste any of the time. We sped up Tyrion's plotline, and I really did enjoy that. So let's talk about then Daenerys, which is kind of the last main plot, and I thought she was actually really well handled from the book. Daenerys, to me, the biggest issue that she has in the source material in Dance with the Dragons is a lot of her chapters kind of run together, where it's like it's hard to remember her chapters because some of them feel very inconsequential or ones that should have been combined with other chapters. And so I think D&D do a good job of getting the idea of a Dance with Dragons down and adapting that in a way that's more digestible for a viewer, right? I actually don't have a lot of complaints with Daenerys. I think the way we start out where, you know, she's trying to rule and she's struggling at it, right? She can't control the dragons. Those are the two main plot lines that she has in this season. And so they foreshadow everything quite well, where she has to kill someone that supports her, that does like her, but, you know, he took things into his own hands, and she's trying to you know, rule, you know, having a trial and all of these things. There is one bad thing we'll talk about Daenerys that I kind of forgot about, but we'll get there when we get there. It's a pretty bad one. But, you know, seeing the reaction, again, the people, everybody turning on Daenerys, right? Because the masters don't like her. The rich people don't like her because she killed all these people and she freed slaves and all that. But then she gets to a point where even the, you know, slaves that were just freed don't like her either, right? And so you get to these interesting moments where it's like, how does Daenerys deal with someone that wants to go back into at least slavery because he had a better life than he does now? How do you deal with these situations where you have a group of people that their culture is significantly different to you? How do you adapt to those situations? And so I loved Daenerys in this season because she has to overcome those things, but we don't spend a huge focus on her as like other POVs, like it kind of is in the book, right? It does enough to where you understand what's going on and all of that. The one schmear on Daenerys in this season is Barristan's death. I really hate this death for a number of reasons. One, him dying in this alleyway thing is just terrible. I mean, it is just horrible. And the biggest issue that I don't understand is that if you would have kept Barristan alive till the end of this season, maybe he dies in season 6, fine, he dies in the Siege of Meereen or whatever. The biggest issue that you have with season 6 with Tyrion's plotline is there's just no chemistry between any of the characters outside of Tyrion and Varys in the Meereen plotline. It's the worst plotline of the next season. And having Barristan there would have prompted a lot of interesting conversation between Tyrion and Barristan. And so I think they miss so much here. And yes, it is a good moment in terms of it services the plot. Like, it gets Daenerys moving, and she becomes, you know, extremely kind of cruel, you know, burning this random master who she may not even know did anything wrong. You know, she has a deep emotional issue because of what happens. It affects Grey Worm greatly. You know, Grey Worm and Missandei's plot being pretty good in this season as well. It's a moment that does forward the plot and has repercussions. I just don't like the way it was handled, and that's the biggest issue with it in terms of that plot point. But I do like the way that Daenerys is trying to, you know, connect with her dragons again. She's losing control, and, you know, her having to lock up her dragons, and her, you know, it seems like she has a connection to Drogon because, you know, this moment where, you know, she kills this guy, and that causes this whole big riot, more or less, and Drogon comes back to her because he senses her danger. And so that foreshadows the next moment when she's, you know, she's in the fighting pit with Hizdahr, because she's kind of betrothed more or less to him now. They're going to be married at some point because she wants to try and heal the city. So she's reopening the fighting pit. And we see that that doesn't work, right? People still don't like her. All these things, and the Sons of the Harpy attacking, and Daenerys, you know, being able to connect with Drogon, and finally, for the first time of the entire show, ride Drogon. It's a really great moment, and I think Daenerys is a pretty strong POV, or a pretty strong character within this season. I think she, Jon, and Cersei are probably the strongest of the season. But that is overall my season 5 retrospective. I think if there's anything to take away from season 5, it's still Game of Thrones. In my opinion, it's the last true Game of Thrones season because it still has that feel. Like, certain plot lines and certain scenes, and, you know, I'd say like half this season feels like Game of Thrones, but the other half just doesn't. And it's because it was rushed. And so season 5 is a season I definitely would recommend rewatching because it has a lot of good stuff in there, but it just gets muddled because of things that happen during it and because of how future seasons don't actually work off of what season 5 did. So, okay, so I actually forgot to mention Arya in this season review. So that kind of tells you almost exactly how Arya is in this season. She's just very forgettable. And I think the biggest problem with Arya, and I don't think she's bad at any means, but I think the issue is Arya is a main character. D&D had this weird obsession with Maisie Williams. And so Arya was supposed to be kind of a minor character for this season. Given the source material, she doesn't have many chapters, right? She has like way less chapters than Jon, way less than Dany, way less than Tyrion. She has less than like characters like Theon and other characters like that, Jaime, Cersei. So she was supposed to be kind of a minor character in the season, and D&D didn't really do that. And D&D, I will say, they had a struggle with how do you adapt these scenes where in the book we're almost predominantly in Arya's head, right? Where there's not a lot of things actually happening on screen, but Arya's thinking about a lot of these things that she's being taught and all this stuff. And so a lot of information is conveyed that way. And so when you have a character like Arya who you're not able to be in their head, how do you create those same effects? And so you kind of come to this issue where there's a lot of scenes of Arya where she's just scrubbing bodies and the scenes linger too long, or she's just walking around, or she's sitting around not doing a lot. She kind of has the same issue of Brienne, but her storyline has more focus and logical sense. And so you see Arya, it's like almost one scene seems good, another scene just feels like filler, right? So you'll go from, oh, a scene where Arya is having to contemplate getting rid of her old belongings and hiding Needle, just like in the book, and that's a good scene. But then you have other scenes where, like, when she first gets to the House of Black and White, and we have a ton of different shots of her just waiting at the House of Black and White, and it's like, it just takes too long. It's too much focus on it when we could be focusing on other things. And that's kind of the whole part of Arya, right? And I don't even think her, like, end point is bad either. It's like, you know, her stalking Meryn Trant, you know, waiting to see where he's going and what is his weakness, how can she get at him, and then killing him. Because it puts in contrast the two issues going on, right? Is she a Faceless Man, or is she Arya Stark? It's the same issue a lot of our characters had in kind of, for instance, Season 1 or Book 1, where they're finding themselves. Whether they're either, you know, trying to be a Night's Watchman, or are they still loyal to their family? Should they be helping the Starks? You know, Jon's plotline, for instance. And Arya kind of has that in this season, but it's just done in a quite a worse way. It just isn't as good. And so it comes out as being very, very forgettable, because a lot of her scenes just, some of them can be really good, and other ones can be kind of filler, right? So a scene I look back and I remember pretty fondly is Arya, you know, getting the little girl to drink from the water because she's sick and she's not getting any better. And her father wants her to, you know, die so she doesn't have to keep having this pain. So that's a good scene, right? And that's kind of the whole thing for Arya. And so when you finally get to Arya's endpoint, which is kind of the most jarring part of her whole arc, it's her, you know, becoming blind, which is a really big twist, but also, you know, she's picking at these faces of Jaqen, who she thinks, you know, poisoned and killed himself, and she still hasn't realized this, there is no Jaqen, it's no one. And the one thing I will say is there's a lot of stuff that's not explained here. How does Arya exactly get poisoned? She doesn't drink anything. It just happens. And also this face stuff, it just seems to happen. How is there layers and layers of different faces on somebody's, you know, body? And then Arya seeing her own face. There's a lot of stuff that's never explained. Even in Season 6, they don't explain how any of this works. It's just meant to work because this is some magical place and it's never explained again. That's not to say magic should always be explained and never have any type of mysterious qualities to it, but it should have, you know, boundaries. It should have, okay, don't go over this. And so this plot just didn't make any sense at the very end, right? It was a natural consequence to what Arya does. She disobeys the Faceless Men, but it doesn't really land, right? Because it kind of just seems really random. And so that's why Arya is very forgettable in this season. I think of all the seasons, this is the one most people are going to forget that she's even in. I forgot she was in here and talking about all the plots, and we even talked about Dorne in this plot, or in this recap. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about Season 5. I think there's definitely some highs, some lows, but I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.